Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for this afternoon's webinar here with NCAN International Student Clearinghouse. We're going to give folks like a few minutes to get situated, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Once again, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for today's webinar here with NCAN and the National Student Clearinghouse. It looks like folks are still joining the webinar, so we'll go ahead and give folks a minute to get situated, and then we'll get started in about a minute or two. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Once again, welcome to today's webinar, and thank you guys for joining us today. I'm going to get us started with a few housekeeping questions, but first I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Karen Sambray. I'm the External Relations Associate here at NCAN. And before we get started with today's webinar, I'm just going to walk through a couple of housekeeping items for us today. To preserve audio quality, all attendees are in listen-only mode. And just as a heads up, we likely won't have time for a formal question and answer from attendees, but we will be monitoring the chat. So any questions that you guys have today, please feel free to put them into the chat. Like I said, please submit your thoughts and questions, and we'll do our best to address them in subsequent communication. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to anyone on NCAN's YouTube channel. We won't be showing slides, but I will be providing the link to the report that is referenced today, as well as NCAN's summary blog as well. And I will put all of the housekeeping notes that I just spoke aloud here in the chat as well for folks who joined us a little bit late. But that is all for the housekeeping notes. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Kim Cook, who is NCAN's Executive Director, who will be leading today's webinar. Kim?
Thank you, Carm. Hello and welcome to Is the High School to College Pipeline Broken? The Data Say Yes. My name is Kim Cook, and I'm the Executive Director of the National College Attainment Network. NCAN works with nearly 500 member organizations, including community-based organizations, school districts, and higher ed institutions across the country to close equity gaps in post-secondary access and attainment. Equity was top of mind for us at NCAN when we approached the National Student Clearinghouse to ask for a specific report focusing on enrollment data for the high school class of 2020. The first high school graduating class impacted by COVID, the resulting economic downturn, and a time of exacerbated inequities in health, education, and opportunity. We are proud to have helped move that report at warp speed to advocate for responsive policy, practice, and system change to address the crisis. We're pleased to present that report, High School Benchmarks 2020, National College Progression Rates, to you today on this webinar. I'm both excited and sobered for our discussion today. We are speaking today at a time of great hope, but also great peril for our country. Great hope because we have received good news in recent weeks about forthcoming vaccines that will help life return to normalcy after what has been a very difficult year. Great peril because this winter will be long and hard for many Americans, economically and medically. We knew in our hearts and the early experiences of our advisors across the country that this was a slow motion crisis in the making. Now these data verify that for our heads. The findings are a stunning confirmation of our worst fears overall, and more so for students from high poverty and high minority high schools. Today, these data confirm those worst fears and the manifestation of a spring and summer full of disruption for our students from their learning, their support systems, and their basic needs. Today, we stop speculating about what those challenges will mean and are faced with the reality they created. The data confirm the early warning signs we experienced. Declines in FAFSA completion, declines in fee waiver applications, declines in testing sites, declines in college applications, that they were indeed the proverbial canaries in the coal mine of what was to come for the high school class of 2020, and likely the class of 2021, if we fail to respond to this crisis of opportunity, equity, and economic health of our country. These data must be an urgent call to action. It will not surprise anyone in the audience today to hear that students across the country are imperiled. Their education pathways have been disrupted. Many have consequently made compromises and hard choices about their education futures. We know that our most vulnerable students, students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, first-generation college students, have been most negatively impacted. The consequences are severe, not just for them, but for their families, communities, states, and our nation overall. We know that these students have been negatively impacted because we see it in the data. Our Form Your Future FAFSA tracker shows double-digit percentage declines in FAFSA completions 2 months into this FAFSA cycle, with disproportionate impacts on Title I and high minority high schools. The Common App tells us that college applications have also decreased significantly this fall. And the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, which draws its data from the enrollment records of thousands of post-secondary institutions covering millions of students, has kept the public, practitioners, and policymakers aware of the significant enrollment declines this fall. We will hear more about those momentarily. Despite these declines in financial aid and college applications and enrollment, students and those involved in their post-secondary success have made Herculean efforts to stay on post-secondary pathways. We've heard stories of innovative practices from across the country that NCAN member programs have made to stay connected with students and families. From virtual financial aid nights to chatbots to even using drive-in movie theaters to promote FAFSA completion. Everyone involved in these efforts should be commended. Every student continuing to strive for post-secondary access and attainment should be applauded. And every student who still aspires to attain a degree or credential but does not see a way forward surely must be assisted. But this problem is larger than students or school districts or even state-level policymakers, although each surely has a part to play. The size of our present problem is so large, the scope of need is so vast that at this point, the federal government is the only actor with enough leverage and resources to adequately respond to this challenge. State and local governments and the educational actors they represent need federal assistance, or many run the risk of insolvency in 2021. Student need has skyrocketed due to job loss and catastrophic medical expenses. Our students need immediate need-based aid that could come in the form of doubling the Pell Grant. The time is now for Congress to act, and the data we will discuss today show us why. I now want to introduce our esteemed panel today who will be sharing their experiences, insights, and recommendations. First, Dr. Doug Shapiro is Vice President at the National Student Clearinghouse and the Executive Director of the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. He leads the team that has produced such valuable insights this fall, and he will share new insights from the Research Center's High School Benchmarks for Report today. Next, Stacy Lightfoot is the Public Education Foundation-Chattanooga's Vice President of College and Career Success. Stacy has used her skills and experience in nonprofit work to help students see college as a worthwhile possibility and has a longtime partnership with the Hamilton County School District. Finally, Catalina Cifuentes is the Executive Director of College and Career Readiness in the Riverside, California County Office of Education. In that role, she works closely with districts to ensure all students are accessing A through G requirements and completing graduation requirements. Catalina envisioned and implemented the highly successful Race to Submit program designed to ensure students complete the FAFSA for financial aid. She is also a recent addition to the NCAN Board of Directors. I'm looking forward to moderating and participating in a panel with these esteemed colleagues after Doug walks us through the research. I would now like to turn the floor over to Dr. Doug Shapiro, who will share what the data from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center say about fall enrollment. Following the presentation, we'll ask our panelists to rejoin the conversation and turn on their cameras for the panel discussion. Doug, thank you for being here.
Screen. Thank you, Kim, and thank all of you for joining us online today. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope you can see that.
We're good, Doug. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk, as Kim said, about the, oops, sorry. Sorry, I'm just trying to swap windows here. I'm going to talk about the benchmarks report that we have just released today, and particularly what it says about the effect of the pandemic on college access for high school graduates. In our standard high school benchmarks report, which we wait 1 year for all the data to be collected from both high schools and the colleges, this fall, that means that we would only show enrollments for the 2019 high school graduates entering college in their first fall after graduation. That's still in this report, but we've also done something entirely new this year. We've added this extra feature in response to the unprecedented changes brought on by the pandemic and the huge need for timely information about its impact on students today. And it's thanks to our great partnership with NCAN, and in particular, NCAN's ability to provide support for the extra effort involved in this COVID-19 special analysis, that we were able to accelerate the data and produce an early look at the results for this year's graduates. First fall enrollments for the high school class of 2020. Now, these are preliminary results. It's a smaller sample than we would normally release, but the findings are critically important for the education community to understand about what's happening and what we might be able to do to help address it. At the highest level, here's what we found. First, we compared the same high schools to the same high schools, and we found the same number of graduates this year as last year. So students didn't drop out of high school due to the pandemic, and they didn't fail to graduate, but they did fail to show up at college. And it's pretty clear that the declines this year are due to the pandemic and to the recession that accompanies it, and that they are much larger for already disadvantaged communities. The declines were much steeper, nearly double for graduates of low-income, minority, and urban high schools. And the gaps in college enrollment rates, which in some cases had actually narrowed last year after many years of efforts to improve the equity of college access in this country, have widened again this year, reversing the gains. So all the talk, for example, about these declines in college enrollments being gap years for higher income students, those are relatively small phenomenon compared to the impact on disadvantaged students who are struggling with much more basic challenges than whether they'll be able to attend on-campus football games or what have you. They're struggling with things like unemployed family breadwinners, homelessness, childcare, and lack of broadband internet and devices. And of course, higher rates of COVID cases and deaths in their families and communities. That's real. Those are the real points that are critical to these findings today. The rest is just details, and I'll show you some of them now so that we can attach some numbers to each of these points. First, we compared data for 2,300 high schools that had submitted their graduates files to Student Tracker by mid-September of this fall. And as I said, the overall number of graduates was unchanged, a decline of only 0.1%. And very little variation could we find when we looked at low income, higher income, low minority, high minority, urban or rural schools, any of the categories that we disaggregate by. It was slightly more, but all those changes were under, in most cases, well under 1% change from the number of grads that again, those same high schools reported last year. And so again, the impact of the pandemic, despite all the school closings and disruptions last spring, was not on the number of high school graduates. And what that means is that when we look at how many high school graduates went to college this fall, we're not talking about changes in how many high school graduates there were. It's all about how many of them went to college. So this is a very simple chart. It's the year-over-year percent change in the number of graduates going to college last year and this year. And from that same set of 2,300 high schools, we've matched their graduates against the enrollment files from about half of all the colleges and universities. Those are the ones that had sent in their regular data to the Clearinghouse in time for this study. It's the exact same colleges in each of the 3 years as well. So it's really an apples to apples comparison. And what you see is, first, a small decline in the number of graduates last year, 2.8% compared to fall of 2018, and a much bigger decline this year. That's the 22% decline in 2020 compared to 2019 on the right. And we can pretty safely assume that the 2019 decline is due to the underlying demographic and economic trends pre-pandemic, and the 2020 decline over and above that trend is the combined effect of the pandemic, the recession, and everything else. And I really want to be clear, this 22% is huge. We've been producing this benchmarks report annually since 2013, and we've never seen a change of more than a couple of percentage points in a year, couple of percent in a year. And by the way, most of that 22% drop is attributable to fewer students going to community colleges and private four-year schools. They're each down about 30% from last year, whereas there are only about 14% fewer high school graduates going to four-year public colleges this year. So here's the same finding, but highlighting the differences by disaggregating along 4 different types of high school characteristics. And we're showing comparisons between the students from poorer, more minority, and more urban high schools, those are the orange bars, compared to their less disadvantaged peer schools, those are the blue bars. And again, you see small declines of a few percent in 2019, regardless of types of schools. If anything, they're showing slightly smaller declines last year among the disadvantaged schools, generally just 1.5%, 2%, showing that they were actually making relative gains last year compared to their more advantaged peers. But on the fall 2020 bars, you see the huge declines, and the declines are far steeper for the orange bars than the blues. For example, if we look at the high poverty high schools, that's the upper right chart there, they're 33% lower. That's twice as large as they are for the low poverty schools in that at 16.5%. So, for example, the average one of those schools that sent, say, 60 graduates to college last year would have sent only 40 students to college this year. The decline was 26% for high minority schools. That's the lower left box. That's almost 50% larger than the drop for low minority schools at 18%. And you see there's less of a disparity by high school location between urban schools and their rural and suburban categories. But they're still declining by 25% for urban high schools, several points worse than the average. And finally, we come to the gaps in the actual enrollment rates. That is the straight percent of graduates enrolling in each year. It's just a different look at the same data, showing the trend over 3 years in enrollment rates rather than the absolute number of enrollees. And again, we're only counting the students who enrolled from these high schools into one of the colleges, about half of the total colleges that we had data from when we did the match. So these rates, these enrollment rates, are about half of what they will become once all the college data are in. So for example, if you look at the standards section of the full benchmarks report, where we've shown results for the class of 2019 using all the data, the enrollment rates for higher income high schools are 68%, and they're 55% for low income schools. Each of those is just about double what's appearing in this chart on the left here for higher income and low income schools in 2019, that 39% and 30%. So just to get that out of the way so you have a reference point for why these rates look so low compared to what we're used to. The important thing is that you can see the consistent and sizable gaps across the board, which we've seen every year in our reports, between the blues and oranges, essentially, between the more advantaged and less advantaged high schools. And in these charts, they range from about 9 to 11 percentage points. That's just the distance between the two lines in the two graphs. But all the rates are also falling dramatically this year by 7 to 9 percentage points. So the low-income students from low-income schools who were enrolling in these colleges at a 30% rate in 2019 are enrolling only at a 21% rate in 2020. And if you look closely on that first chart on the left, the gap between the higher and lower income schools, you can see it's actually narrowed a bit, just a bit last year. And then it widened again even more this year. So we've reversed the gain from last year, the gain in closing achievement at college access gaps, and then some. The exact same pattern also appears in the minority chart on the right, but the differences are smaller and they're harder to see at this scale. The gap narrowed by about 1/3 of a percentage point last year, and it widened again by just under a full percentage point this year. So once again, we've lost ground going back to where we were 2 years ago. So I'm showing this for just 2 of the 4 high school variables, income level and minority level. The patterns are similar for the other 2 disaggregations by poverty level and by school locations. And again, these effects align very closely with what we know about the disparate impacts of the pandemic and the recession on disadvantaged communities and urban communities, and particularly what was happening back in the spring and summer of 2020, when counseling should have been taking place in the high schools, FAFSAs should have been completed, enrollment decisions were being made, etc. So in that sense, it's a very discouraging confirmation with real numbers of what we expected all along, that the gaps would widen between these disadvantaged communities and their more advantaged peers. So I'll stop there so we can have plenty of time for further discussion. There's a lot more in the report, including breakdowns for specific types of high schools at specific types of colleges, where you can see the changes this year in graduates of lower income high schools who go to community colleges, for example, compared to those going to 4-year private colleges or 4-year public colleges, and much more. You'll see even more evidence there, as in this small snapshot that I'm showing you today, that we need to find ways to not only address the losses for the class of 2020, but also to prevent them from impacting the class of 2021 as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Stunning numbers that are really hard to absorb. 21.7 percentage point decline in college going for the high school class of 2020, with the unfortunately expected exacerbated inequities for students from high poverty and low income high schools. We're going to work to unpack that. I'm going to turn to and ask our panelists to join me and Doug for some conversation about these numbers. While they are joining and turning on their webcams, I'll just remind you that in the chat, we have posted links to the full report, to NCAN's summary blog, and that we will be sharing this recording on NCAN's YouTube channel for everyone. So we have the many questions of folks who want to know how to share that. Doug, I understand we have some technical difficulty and we do not get to see your face and the camera here, but you are still very much with us. So thank you for persevering. So Doug, I'm going to start with you. We have so much to say. I'm going to ask if we can try to keep our responses top line and see how many we can get through here, and see if we can also get to some questions from the audience and themes that are coming there. But Doug, starting with you, the numbers are extraordinary, so extraordinary that many might hope to dispute them. How do you respond to the stunning decline and the exacerbated impact on high poverty and low income student enrollment?
Well, first, I think in terms of the numbers, we do have to keep emphasizing that these are preliminary data from just the high schools and just the colleges who were able to submit their data earlier this year. And when we've done this for the college enrollment side alone, we've updated that data each month in the course of the fall term as more colleges reported and as the data became more and more complete. So
sorry, go ahead, Doug.
So even when we got to 75% and now we're closer to 100% of colleges reporting, we have seen the numbers fluctuate as more data comes in. So these aren't final, but for the most part, the patterns are unchanged and the general picture is unchanged, and the fluctuations are they're quite small compared to the magnitude of the impact of the pandemic that we're seeing.
So unfortunately, these are very representative numbers of what will continue to roll out as more data come in.
That's right.
Catalina and Stacy, on reactions to the findings, Catalina, I'll start with you and say on a related note, some might say that students are taking a so-called gap year. How do these data that Doug presented match with your experiences in your district? And what do you expect for students who are not continuously enrolled?
Oh, thank you, Kim. First, the data is just alarming. It's scary, and I'm currently waiting, as Doug's presenting, I'm texting our data person, waiting for our student tracker reports to come in. I serve 23 school districts, and over 65% of them would be considered free and reduced lunch, low income, Title I high schools, about 31,000 graduates. And when you see articles, and I say any college access professionals or school counselors that are on, when you see articles, especially if you serve that population of a gap year, that does not apply to you. That gap year and the students that we serve, the gap year means a full-time job that now mom and dad get used to the income, and the likelihood of them going back is slim to none. And our students don't have necessarily that luxury to take a gap year. They're not exploring their options or doing an unpaid internship. If they're not going to school, and working part-time, they're most likely going to work full-time. And what we found is, even in the spring of the pandemic, a lot of the school districts, they did, many throughout the nation, they did hold no harmless. Students' grades, whatever your grade was, that's what you stayed. So a lot of our students took on jobs. They took on delivery and DoorDash. They took on jobs, and they are now trying to keep these jobs through the summer. And now we see that high DNF rate, historical high DNF rates with our high schools. And so the gap year for me does not apply to our students, and it's leading to them getting further stuck in that cycle of poverty, of that entry-level job, minimum wage job. And that's more than ever, we can't risk even letting them take a semester off. We have to try to re-engage them, especially because of the families they live with, their parents, guardians. And it's no shame to the parents and the guardians. I mean, this is watching siblings so the parents could work. You know, we have students that have been taken to another country, to Mexico, to stay with grandma because the parents have to work and there's no daycare. And we can see they're engaging from Mexico because of some of the apps and the student sites we're using. So like I said, when I see that, I feel we have to ramp up even more than before.
Catalina, thank you for sounding that alarm and for talking about the experiences of our students who really are in a go, no-go situation and choosing the path and trajectory of their lives and their families' lives moving ahead. We'll come back in a next round of questions to talk about some of the strategies that you've been implementing. Stacy, I want to turn to you and welcome you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Kim.
We often talk about the importance of being data-driven. How does having access to these kinds of enrollment data inform your work and map out what we need to do?
Thank you so much for that question, Kim. At the Public Education Foundation in Chattanooga, we have partnered very deeply and meaningfully with our district, Hamilton County Schools, since 2005, collecting data, National Student Clearinghouse data, and tracking students' college matriculation, their persistence and their retention rates, and also 6-year graduation rates of students from our public schools. And we have used that information and that data since 2005 to really inform the work that we do and the partnerships and collaborations that we've been able to make with our district. We know where our students are going. We know where our students are succeeding. So we know which colleges are doing well with our students, and that has really helped build a college-going culture within many of our schools and informed research and student focus groups, and using that information to build stronger and more robust systems and partnerships, and bringing the right people at the table around the right set of information and around the right set of data. And it's allowed us to include more stakeholders as well. And it's allowed us to strengthen our partnerships with higher ed institutions, especially those where we know our students are going the most, and building better partnerships and systems within our community college, for example, our local 4-year institutions, to really shed light on the stories and the backgrounds of our students, so we can really pinpoint those students' needs, and those institutions can prepare to intervene and create the kinds of services that our students uniquely need in order to be successful and persist through and complete their 2-year degree or their 4-year degree. And I'll also say this. So we have been using National Student Clearinghouse data, and something that's really special that happens in Hamilton County Schools is we bring school folks together. We bring principals together. We bring networks of school counselors and advisors together on a consistent and regular basis to review that data. And we're able to get down to, by student and student's name to figure out what the pathway of students are. So we can go back to the schools and go back to school populations and student populations to say, hey, here are the set of supports that this particular student has had at this college. So this college knows what to do with students like them to help them, matriculate to and be successful in completion. So using that data to inform the work and working with networks inside of schools and partnerships with higher ed institutions has been extremely instrumental in Chattanooga.
Thank you, Stacy. That's a lovely transition into the next round of questions and conversation I'd like to spark here, and that's around strategy. There's been so much innovation from local programs, from districts, from states. Much of that is documented on NCAN's What Works website. I touched on a few of those in the opening remarks, but clearly, this report and these data will spark a lot of conversations about strategies to help reach out to that class of 2020, and also to halt and prevent a repeat of these data for the class of 2021. So Catalina, the data are clearly an urgent call to action. At the district level and at the education office level, how have you put all hands on deck to turn the tide?
So it's like you mentioned, Kim, we're building the plane as we're flying it, but we're truly, what we're doing is a lot of different change ideas and kind of monitoring the successfulness. And I will just say, what we're finding, things that worked 8 months ago, right? Like some of the text messaging things, that was the innovation, and two-way texting. They're not as successful as much. Text messaging is working when the student has a relationship with the teacher or the counselor or the college advisor. But the come-alls, like we're doing FAFSA tomorrow or Saturday or financial aid application, those aren't working anymore. And what we're finding is we're going back in the day when it's old school one-on-one, because we have students that aren't doing well. When this pandemic first hit, I was worried about class of 2020, but when all the policies came of hold harmless and testing, no testing, all of that came, we knew they were going to be okay. I immediately was worried about this class, and now we're seeing it with the amounts of D's and F's. So Catalina gets an email that says college application workshops next week, but I'm getting a D in AP Calculus or an F in English. I'm thinking, I'm not college material anymore. So it's taking that phone call, Kim saying, Catalina, what's going on? You have a 3.9. I know you're not doing well, but let's talk about that. Let's re-engage. And so we're having to look at re-engagement strategies because, and staffing. So you cannot rely on school counselors alone to do this. And so, one of the first advice I'd give to people participating today is, take a list, get a whiteboard or get a piece of paper, list everyone on your staff that either has the will or the want to help with this work. And whether it's community members, we see Tennessee Achieves has been doing this for years, training 7,000 volunteers. I was like, dancing around that idea 8 months ago. I'm ramping up that idea and reaching out to people, to Graham Thomas, and saying, okay, I need volunteers, because it's that human connection that's making the difference. And so I'd say get a whiteboard, make a list of who could engage with you, who'd want to help, that's outside the norms. If you have campus supervisors that aren't supervising students because you're closed, maybe they want to get FAFSA trained and help the school counselors or help your college access network to participate. It's those one-on-ones of checking in, and that's making all the difference. And I just have to echo what Stacy mentioned earlier. Our county office was the first county office in the state to pay for National Student Clearinghouse data for every high school, every school district in our county, right? So it's, over 100 high schools. And it's through that data monitoring, we're able to be more intentional. So one best practice, or we're trying it, we'll see if it's a best practice tomorrow, is we're phone banking students, because we have that type of level data of where our students have applied in reference to the top, 3-4 campuses we traditionally attend. We're actually taking a team of about 75 educators, teachers, administrators, assistant superintendents, and we have hit lists that we're phone banking, because December 15th is UC and CSU deadlines for our state. So we're realizing the text, the come-alls, it's not working. We're able to become more newsletters. It's not. These are the students that are going to need us to pick up the phone. And you got to remember, they didn't get that in the spring. They didn't get all the college fit and match conversations in the spring. All that fell off. And then this, and then now they're doing bad academically. So just some ideas.
Thanks, Catalina. It goes back to the saying that many of us were brought up with in this field about one arm around one child, and the importance of individual outreach. Doug, I'm going to turn to you on that individual outreach idea. Many who are on this call may be wondering how their early data compare to this national report. How can districts, higher ed institutions, and community-based organizations access their specific data to know where to intervene and to start that individual outreach that Catalina says is so critical?
Well, as both Catalina and Stacy talked about, it really is through the student tracker service and the ability to not only look at the aggregate reports that we send to inform inform the high schools and districts about the rates and the average numbers of graduates who are showing up in college this fall, but also to be able to drill down and look at the detailed report and go one by one, as you said, for that groundwork that's so important of reaching out and knowing which students that should have enrolled didn't make it, and also to follow up every month, or even after the new year. You know, even in a typical year, we see not insignificant percentages of students, particularly students headed to community colleges, who don't enroll in the fall, but they will start in the spring term or winter term instead. And so it's important to be able to refresh your student tracker views, your matches, so that you know who's managed to get back enrolled this January, for example, or February, and be able to use that information to really target your efforts and the value, you know, conserve the valuable time of all those teams of high school staff that are stepping up to reach out and man those phone banks, and really be able to focus their efforts on the students who are still falling through the cracks.
I'd like to add something that I mean, we've been kind of privileged to have access to additional funds through a national organization to fund college advancement mentors. We've had those mentors for the last year, and that's in partnership with our higher ed institutions here in Chattanooga, as well as our district and the Public Education Foundation. And those CAMs, we call them CAMs, College Advancement Mentors, work with our higher ed partners to get lists of students through the summer who said they were going to go to college, who applied to a particular college, but hadn't completed all the steps. And we know about summer melt and how prevalent summer melt was before COVID, but definitely how summer melt was exacerbated because of the pandemic. And we have seen, based on the strong partnership and those CAMs working with our district's college and career advisors, we're able to really eliminate some of the negative impact of COVID due to that individualized outreach and support that students had. Although we didn't see a large jump in numbers, we do attribute those individuals in that partnership with those advisors from our district and those additional mentors to really eliminating the negative impacts that we think we would have seen otherwise in retention rates and persistence rates, as well as college matriculation rates for this fall. So I just wanted to echo what you all have said, the importance of the human person. I think students are disenfranchised, and definitely were disenfranchised last, spring with the online platform and transitioning to online learning. And the thought of going into college as a first-year student, having to deal with what you had to deal with in high school to deal with in college, students are like, absolutely, absolutely not. Mentally, I'm tapped out. And if I have to choose between online learning and getting a job to help my family cover for those losses, I'm going to choose work. So just to your point, Catalina, we've seen those stories, and even the requests that we've had from students for their emergency assistant needs, basic needs, food, housing, has tripled. And those problems existed and those challenges existed with our students before, but we are seeing students with some of the greatest food insecurities and the greatest just basic needs going unmet this summer and this fall. So thank you for lifting that up, Kim, and your questions, and Doug, through your research.
Yeah, really powerful to talk about where the needs are and how individual the response needs to be. Stacy, I'm going to turn to you with a bit of a different strategy. We're talking a lot about direct service here. We're talking about touching students. As I shift to more of a systemic change and levers for change, I'd like to ask you your thoughts on the role of policy and advocacy. Where do you see opportunities, and are there specific opportunities where the federal government can step in to address the conditions causing these declines in enrollment?
Great question, Kim. And when we talk about what students have to choose between, like work or school, knowing that the costs that are associated with going to college, books, room, board, tuition and fees, the first thing that comes to mind is the Pell Grant, right? Like the Pell Grant covers around 30% or little less than 30% of public schools tuition and fees. So when I think about the implications of what policymakers, like the influence that policymakers can have on doubling the Pell Grant, especially for the low to moderate income families, I think would be unbelievably a critical next step and an important next step for policymakers and our federal friends to consider and reevaluate. And not only that, is there a way to incentivize Pell Grant students and institutions for college completion? Are there incentives that students can have along the way completing, particular hours, during the semester, for those who are getting Pell Grant? We know that the graduation gaps, the graduation gap between low-income students and more financially resourced families, that data is well documented. And we know that Pell Grant students are not graduating and completing college at the same rates. So just thinking of creative ways to support states and to support districts in the services and robust services that they can provide towards student success, and the financial implications for doubling the Pell Grant would be extremely amazing if that could happen and Congress could get together and address that.
Yeah, thank you for your insight. Obviously, doubling the Pell Grant is one of NCAN's policy priorities, along with simplifying the FAFSA that we would hope could unlock much of this very needed aid to our students. Catalina, is there anything you'd like to add to the policy discussion?
I was just going to say, Kim, you and the NCAN team have done a tremendous job with the policy and advocacy, especially around, the FAFSA simplification. I think, we know we're in our nation's in a world of hurt, fiscally, and our states. So I think, okay, what are some big decisions that can have high leverage? And I think I like the FAFSA simplification, not only for the stress and anxiety and the time it takes for the student, but for us, for the practitioners that are with the students. Some of those decisions, it's like the return could be huge if those decisions are made. And with the simplification, and just when recently NCAN shared the information about the verification, then I figured you were going to bring that up too, Kim, for those who didn't know about the verification decrease. That was a win for us. We said, okay, all right, 18% now, not 30, so it's only 18 of you in the Zoom room, and it's just kind of, it helps those things. So it's like, did it cost a lot of money? I don't know. I think you'll share it's probably going to save them money. And I think those are the things, some wins. And I'm appreciative to you and the NCAN family for pushing those pieces, because it's time. Maybe it's not just the money, but it's the effort so we can help more students.
And since we talked about verification, the simplification of the FAFSA, I know Senator Lamar Alexander has been working for years to simplify such a daunting form with questions that trip so many families up. And we know that the FAFSA is the gateway to any kind of federal or state funding. And so just simplifying the process along the way for students could prove to be extremely advantageous for students, especially through the pandemic, during the pandemic, trying to lift the burden from students and families. And extending deadlines. I know our Tennessee Promise deadline was extended. I mean, that made a world of difference, and we saw an increase in just a few weeks of students who had applied for the Tennessee Promise who just needed more time because the adults needed more time to access those students or track those students down. We're seeing that a lot of students are not in buildings, right? They're not in the buildings. So everyone has had to adjust and pivot to the virtual platform and the online platform. And again, students, it's hard to reach students because they're kind of tired of the virtual platform. So communities have been really creative and innovative in the ways that they've reached students. And just the simple notion of extending a deadline has proven to be successful in Tennessee.
Well, thank you both, and thank you to our many NCAN members on the line who have shared their stories, helped students share their stories, and become the fierce advocates that you all are and that you help NCAN be for federal policy that can help turn the tide here. Our work is clearly still ahead of us, but we're fortunate to have so many committed, passionate members who see policy as a lever for change and to move these numbers. Time is flying by, so I'm going to go to our closing question here, incredibly, and just reflect a bit on the headline here that a 21.7% decline in college enrollment from high school in the class of 2020 means that 1 in 5 students that we expected to enroll in college did not, and more starkly, 1 in 3 students in low-income high schools that we expected to enroll in college did not. I'm going to ask each of you to reflect, and maybe we'll start with Doug. What is a key intervention that can bring a completely different headline this time next year?
Well, I wish I had an answer for that. I do think there's 2 really important approaches that have to change between now and next fall, and that has to do with not just the recovery or reclaiming of the losses that we've seen for the class of 2020 already, but to do everything we can at the same time to learn from that experience and to make sure that it doesn't happen again for the class of 2021. There's just too much evidence from all that we know about persistence and momentum among students heading to college and staying in college, that whether it's a gap year or a financial gap or any of the other reasons that are keeping this year's high school graduates away from college this fall, we know that the longer they stay away, the lower their chances of ever getting back on track and recovering the opportunity to learn and improve their skills and employability in the future. And that's the hardest challenge, in my view, is getting students back on track as quickly as possible.
Kim,
Absolutely.
if I could
Thank you, Doug.
Oh, sorry.
Jump ball, Stacy, it's you. Yeah, go ahead,
no,
please.
If I could create a headline, it would be something like all hands on deck. Partnerships matter. I know you all have heard me say partnerships plenty of times during this webinar, but I'll give you an example. This summer, our community, our district, Hamilton County Schools, launched something called Ed Connect. And it provides any student in Hamilton County who's on free or reduced lunch the access to no cost home internet. And so we joined forces with the Electric Power Board and Hamilton County Schools and a plethora of other community partners to provide close to 30,000 students in our district with no cost internet. And that took place, and that was able to happen as quickly as it did this summer because of the collective movement and the collective impact and the collective spirit and the collaborative spirit of folks in Chattanooga. So if we want to see change and significant change, I think everyone has to be on board and be willing to pivot and move and adapt quickly. We saw very, very well how folks in our communities and around the nation were able to take policies and shift those policies in order to do X, Y, or Z. And when we think of the word equity, and when we think of the digital divide or the digital chasm, and what we were able to do very quickly with Hamilton County Ed Connect, I think if we put those forces together and you have those partners constantly coming to the table to address and focus on student success, I think we can see a significant increase in impact in the areas of students who are going to college and succeeding in college. So all hands on deck, partnerships truly matter.
And I would
Absolutely.
just add,
Thank you, Stacy.
and I would just add and
Yeah,
echo.
Catalina, please bring us home. Yep.
Please, no, I would just add to echo what Stacy shared. And I think we have in our county, we have over almost 4,000 more students going and enrolling in college before class of 2020 than we did 5 years ago. And we have direct correlation to that data correlating to the number of juvenile felony arrest rates. We now have the lowest juvenile felony arrest rates, the lowest suspension rates, the lowest dropout rate in the state of California, Riverside County does, and the highest graduation rate. That we didn't go after the negative, we went after the rigor and increasing more students going to college. And I think if we have to rally, and like Stacy mentioned, besides just educators, community members, everybody, because this will have more than just the repercussions of college. It's affecting communities. You got to think of how much Pell Grant money was coming into the state of, my state in California, because those students were going to college, federal dollars, other programs. So there's more repercussions than just, they didn't enroll in college. And I think that's getting those other types of membership, your mayors and others, what are they going to be doing? If they don't have a job and they're not in school, what's going to happen? And that's my fear, right? And so I think another piece is, our students don't know. I'm going to say more, our partners on today, the students you serve, they don't know what they don't know. They're first generation. They're making these decisions, not understanding or truly knowing the entire system. So I had a student that wasn't going to apply, was almost a 4.0 UC candidate. I mean, just amazing student. And she says, well, my dad lost his job and I don't think, I won't get any, I'm afraid we can't pay for college. Not realizing that because even when her dad was working, her expected family contribution was still zero. If I can get her into UC Riverside, she'll still get a full blue and gold tuition and fees. She just didn't know that. And I think more than ever, when you call Bobby and Bobby says, no, I'm not gonna go. I said, Bobby, let me talk to your mom. Let me make sure this is a family decision, because the families just don't understand the system. And we weren't able to do what we've normally done because of where we ended in the spring, especially for the class of 21. But my advice is, let's not give up on 2020. Let's rally around them. Let's try to get them back in spring. I believe we can. I believe hopefully some of them have seen that, I don't know if I want to work this type of job full time. Maybe I do want to go back to school, and let's start and not give into just it is what it is.
Could not think of a better way to inspire and wrap up this really robust conversation. Thank you, Catalina, for reminding us the class of 2020 still needs our help. And to all of you for talking about the strategies that we can put in place and amplify to prevent this headline repeating for the class of 2021. Catalina, Stacy, Doug, thank you so much for everything you've brought to this conversation. I know the chat was exploding with questions. I believe we'll be following up with a FAQ for Doug about some of the data questions. And a reminder as we come to time here that In the chat, we've posted links to the full report. We've posted links to my colleague Bill DeBond's summary blog on the NCAN website, and that shortly we will be posting this recording to NCAN's YouTube channel if you want to share it with others. Many thanks to, again, our panelists, the Research Center team for moving heaven and earth to get these data out at warp speed. And to all of you who are joining us because you care about these numbers and because you too are working to turn the tide and change the outcomes for our students to increase equity in post-secondary attainment. Thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon.